Okay, good afternoon, folks. It's currently the 14th of January of 2020. This is the first customer success team office hours we've done this year. So this is for VMware Cloud on AWS. Joining me live today, we have Demarcus, Ricky, and Double Z or Zach. And we also have one of our customer success managers just joining in as well. So Claire, welcome to the call. You are live on the internet. Thrilling, I know. What we typically like to do on these calls is just have a quick dive into the release notes first of all, and then we will just see if anything new has come up since the last time. I looked the other day actually, and there was nothing new posted, and all of a sudden there's been a flurry of activity, as you can see from the release notes. So we've had a few new things pop up. Welcome to some other colleagues that's just joined. Fabio, Gus, Prasanna, you've all just joined in. Thank you for that. So I was just saying the flow of these calls is we typically look at the release notes, see if anything new's come up, and then we dive into some content stuff that we've been seeing in the field, and then also anything else, any questions that you guys want to bring up, or anything you've seen, anything that people on the chat want to ask us about as well. And welcome Asaf, Darren, Lisa, and Ruth for joining in as well. Thank you for that. So into the release notes first of all. So we've had a couple of things pop up at the beginning of the year. One which has been the much awaited new region opening up in Europe, and that's in Stockholm. We've got a couple of customers that have eagerly been awaiting this. So as far as I'm aware, that's a fully capable region. There are no restrictions on it as far as I'm aware at the moment. So yeah, unless anybody tells me different, that's all good to go. And we've also had a change in how you can actually pay for your subscriptions now as well. So obviously, as you all know, when you subscribe to VMC on AWS, if you subscribe for 1 or 3 year terms, you get a discounted pricing. The discount is obviously greater the longer the subscription term, but you can now pay on a monthly installment basis, which may help for some people's sort of operational costing. So yeah, that's pretty much the new stuff that's come out at the beginning of the year. I know the Stockholm region's a good one, and I know a couple of customers that have been eagerly awaiting that. I don't know if any of the guys and girls on the call have been awaiting that one as well. There's at least two big customers I know of that have been waiting for it. But yeah, so what I've done recently as well, we're trying to reinvigorate these calls and get some questions, some content to review ahead of time. And we've had a couple of things come up lately, which I'm going to dive into now. And then hopefully this forms the basis of an open discussion, and we can grow and go on from there. So if anybody on the line also wants to dive in with any questions, you have the Zoom chat. You also have the Twitch chat stream if you're watching live via Twitch, and if you are watching this recording on YouTube, feel free to post comments in the YouTube page, and we will pick those up as we review that on a weekly basis. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to cover first of all, stuff that's come up this week, and one was around design decisions for separation of workloads, we'll call it. So it's quite an open topic. But what I mean by this is, where do you define your separation, and why do you define a separation? So as you know, when you log into the cloud service portal, this is the org. This is the highest level structure, and within the organization, the org, you then can create software-defined data centers, SDDCs, and then within an SDDC, you can create clusters. Now, these are all types of boundary, and they all have different, let's say, security boundaries or resource boundaries that are inherent depending where you deploy. And something that came up today was as a question from a customer as to which one we should choose. So I thought we'd discuss it and go into it in a bit more detail. as this comes up quite frequently actually. So if let's say we start at the top and we talk about it from an organization structure. So when you are granted access to your organization, let's have a look on screen. So this is our test lab here, and this is our org. And within our org, we have created multiple SDDCs, as you can see here. Now, from a functionality and a security boundary perspective, anybody who has access to this organization can create and manage SDDCs within this organization. So there is no sort of granular permissioning done at the SDDC level within the organization. Now, this is great if you have one company and your orgs or your SDDCs that you create within an organization are maybe departmental, or these are all different test scenarios that you're building out. But if you had a regulatory or a compliance constraint, or even you were acting like a service provider and wanted to provide compute and SDDCs out to multiple customers that also needed access to the portal, having a single organization wouldn't be the best approach, primarily because you cannot break down the permissioning to SDDCs, as I just said. So anybody else got anything that they wanted to add at that sort of organization there? Any other input or reasoning why organization level separation might not be the best for them? It's always good when it's radio silence.
Yeah, I was just going to add funding.
Funding, yeah, good point.
Be one reason where
yeah. So actually, that is a good point. So some companies, some organizations, the IT infrastructure or the IT department is still owned. The cost for that is still owned by IT. It's viewed as almost a free resource to departments, to teams, to be used within that company. Other companies have a different structure, and they bill their customers or their departments within that company for what they consume, whether it be on-prem or in the cloud. And currently in VMC, the billing structure, the way billing is worked out, is at that org layer, right, Prasanna? So it's very difficult then to be able to sort of drill into it and say, well, you customer A, with this SDDC, you used 10% resource, and you customer 2, department 2 used 13%. So these are your costs. So it's not so easy to do. So yeah, a good point. If you have a requirement to segregate or separate that billing between different customers or departments or whatever, you're naturally going to have to have separate organizations. Now, can anybody online think of a reason or a con, or a downside to having multiple organizations? Are there any negatives to that?
Just managing, you have to flip back and forth between them if you're managing, if you have access to multiple.
Absolutely. So management overhead is a good one. So you would have to have multiple consoles set up here to view the different organizations, because there's a security boundary between the two. Anything else?
Yeah, I could also add to the management point that it would be a hassle with billing, since there's an ABD for each org, and you might get lost within the details regarding what should be billed when and what subscription would end when and stuff like that.
Yeah, good point, Mona, actually. So if you are if you're wanting to simplify things but then still have a degree of separation, you're kind of in a tricky position, right? And there are potential ways around that. So we do have a version of this portal that you're looking at currently. We do have a version of this for service providers. So it's kind of one layer of abstraction above, where you have a structure known as the master organization, which is the service providers area that they work within, and then they can provide tenant organizations underneath. So there's kind of that degree of separation, and that's where you can define the billing out. So you can define billing at the tenant. So a service provider will take on board customers in a very unknown fashion. They won't know when they're going to take on board a new customer, so you can't obviously have all the billing end on one day or the same day or whatever. So having that different interface is a requirement for them. But if you're just a standard one company, one customer with departments that you need to do different billing for, yeah, it gets a bit tricky.
Well, I have a customer that is running 2 orgs attached to the same fund, and they've been doing it for about 9 months now. And they've found that it's worked really successfully. So they are fully siloed within their organization. So it has separated the users. From a procurement perspective, their budgeting teams are quite happy that they can track who's spending what. But from a security perspective, each team is completely isolated.
Fantastic. So there are obviously ways and means without going down the service provider route. So that was a, I think I know who you're talking about there as well, Ruth. So that was a non-standard way of doing things that we had to come up with, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, but that's great, because when, just like any software company, when we write software, the people that write the software think they're writing for a certain use case, and it will be used in a certain way. And then as soon as the first customer gets it, they start doing different things with that software and pushing the boundaries. And that's brilliant, because they feed that back to us, and then it helps our product set grow, which is better for everybody in the long term, right? So anything else anybody's seen around sort of a need to have separate orgs for any use cases at all? Nope. So identity, I did touch on briefly, and we've talked about on previous calls, federated identity. And that is where you can share your directory services. So, for example, Active Directory on-prem or something like ADFS or Okta as a directory service provider, you can use that as a mechanism of controlling access to this portal. So you can set it up so you can have a group in AD that, say, it's called VMC admins, and they're the only people in that AD group that can log into the portal. Obviously, as I mentioned previously, the roles are not that granular at this org layer, so that would be the driver. So even if you had AD integration set up with federated identity, you would still probably need those multiple orgs to separate out, because one person would have full access to all the SDDCs within. I can't think of any other sort of use cases for multiple orgs aside from hitting any of these sort of limits. So if you hit the cluster limit, and then you hit the SDDC limit, and then you hit all of the limits, and you got to a stage where you couldn't grow your org any further, then that would be the only other use case I could think of where you would need to deploy a secondary org. And I guess, like our software, every year that gets pushed out, or every time a new release of vSphere gets pushed out, the limits we're working to will increase. And maybe VMC slightly faster than the sort of on-prem versions of software. So I've not seen anybody hit the limits yet. I know there are some very large customers in the US, like MIT, Pfizer, and the likes, that may be pushing boundaries there. But that's the only real other use case I can think of for segregating at the org layer. So if we go one layer below and we go to the SDDC layer, so if we look at SDDC separation, so providing departmental separation maybe at the SDDC layer, knowing the constraints that anybody that has access to the portal can access the SDDCs within, and not just one or the other. And then therefore from within the SDDC they can go into the settings and they can see the credentials for the cloud admin account for the vCenter. Therefore they have full vCenter admin access. Any sort of use cases where SDDC separation is good enough, or where it wouldn't be good enough?
Yeah, the primary reason I have seen customers going for multiple SDDCs is the scale limit. Yep.
So good point. So we have limits on sizes of the SDDCs that we can provision, so the number of hosts in a cluster, the number of clusters to an SDDC, and some of these constraints are defined by some of our software, and some of the constraints are defined by AWS, so the underlying infrastructure we're sitting on. There's a soft limit, for example, of 16 hosts per cluster. and it is a soft limit, but the hard limit isn't that much higher anyway. And we've talked about this in the past as well before, where you might see one limit posted and think, oh, that's brilliant. I can have 400 and however many hosts in my SDDC or in my cluster or whatever, and then turns out there's a much smaller number that you are going to hit first of all. So there's a config maximum site for VMC, which you should always pin and refer back to, because this is a live document. So as VMC grows and the config maximums grow with it, this site will be changed live. But I was mentioning here, for example, the number of hosts per cluster, including stretch clusters, is 16. We know that that might be a hard limit of say 20 within a stretch cluster with a certain type of CIDR range for the management cluster, because of hard limits imposed by AWS. Any other limits or reasoning for cluster separation? Sorry, SDDC separation.
I mean, you can put them in different AZs.
Absolutely, yep. So what will that give us, Zach? That will give us maybe higher availability, or
yeah, just HA. Just if one AZ or even a region, you can do different regions entirely as well. Spread them around. You could have your production workloads running in multiple SDDCs, and so if you lose access to one,
yeah, good
you're not
point.
totally dead in the water.
So that's very much an AWS way of doing things, right? So they make the recommendation that you design your workload to be AZ tolerant, right? So it should be application layer resilient, so that if an AZ goes down, the application will still function. Now, it's slightly more difficult when you're talking infrastructure, as we are here, but deploying to multiple AZs or even multiple regions, so having an SDDC in different will absolutely give you that functionality, capability. That brings into play other areas that you need to design in, right, Zach? So whether it be stretching clusters between AZs, or it be making sure the application is resilient across, or even if it's just viewed as a DR, right? So having a secondary SDDC as a DR for a primary SDDC, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Any other sort of justification you could think of where SDDC separation is good enough, or it wouldn't be good enough, for example?
Yeah, I think the slightly related reason is disaster recovery.
Yep.
The DR SDDC can reside in a separate region, and protection run in region.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're reserving that compute as well, right? So you're having guaranteed resource in another SDDC for that failover scenario. Yeah. What about connectivity or bandwidth requirements?
Yeah, that's a good one. Since the SDDC is serviced by a single NSX, we should also look at some of the networking requirements.
Sure. So that goes to that's another of those limits that you need to take into account, right? So you look at the config maximums again, and we go back there and we have a look at, okay, so we can have 16 hosts, and we can have 4,000 VMs, and we can have 200 VMs per host, and you times all those numbers up, and suddenly we're into massive figures. But then you look down at the network security maximums, and then you suddenly realize that there might be a constraint depending on your workload of available throughput for an SDDC. So yeah, that's a good one. Okay, so we kind of talked about organization separation, and we've talked about SDDC separation. There is obviously a cluster separation within your vCenter server. So you're all familiar with the vCenter structure, and within VMware Cloud on AWS, we use resource pools, which is I'd say a nerdy but fun conversation to have with some people. So we use resource pools because we have to guarantee the resource available for the management workloads that we deploy, and then all of the rest is available as workload resource for that first cluster, and then subsequent clusters have full access to the resource for the workload resource pool. So there's a couple of obvious examples of why you would do cluster separation, where that's going to be a good answer, and that would be potentially different hardware types. Obviously, you can't mix and match hardware within a cluster. So by hardware, I mean the available host types that you have underneath. So the i3s and the R5s, they obviously serve a different function, different purpose, have different costs, and then different performance and storage available to each one. So you would have to have different clusters for that. The other would be licensing is always a good one, right? And the first name that pops up when anybody talks about licensing constraints is always Oracle. But you have Microsoft licensing coming into play now as well. Things like SQL Server, we see customers having dedicated clusters for SQL and Oracle workloads, or other workloads that they just kind of want to guarantee the resources available purely for those workloads. I do remember having a customer in the past that had they were an insurance company, and they were one of these companies where they have compare websites. So other websites take their feed and they compare their prices with all the other insurers, kind of like brokers almost. And the challenge they had is if they didn't service a request for a quote within something like 0.6 of a second, they would be listed as a no-show or fail to quote. So they ended up having one SQL server per physical node just so they could guarantee the resource for that physical SQL server, because that was the biggest part of their business. That was the biggest money drive in their business. And so they would effectively actually have two hosts per every SQL server because they had to have HA for that SQL server as well. So a very expensive way around of doing it, but they could justify it based on their requirements. But any other sort of examples of where cluster separation is driven by requirement or wouldn't be sufficient?
Something I learned from you, Will, today.
Yes.
That you can
might not be
actually
true then. I just put that out now.
disclaimer, I'm not sure it's true.
Yeah.
No, it's actually an advantage because you can add one host or two hosts, while if you separate by SDDC, you need to go for a minimum of 3 hosts.
Yeah, so obviously when you deploy a new SDDC, you have that kind of minimum cluster size, right? So you're deploying that first 3 nodes you deploy. You can't just deploy one node and have a resilient cluster, and you can't deploy 2 currently. So you have a 3 node minimum. Now, if you are doing this for a compliance reason or a security reason, you're going to have a cost overhead in deploying multiple SDDCs or multiple clusters, right? So it comes down again to what that balance between how much something's going to cost and what your constraints and your design and your business requirements are, I guess. So if the requirement is we must have separate workloads, and that it's okay with that you could potentially move workloads in between, but we need to guarantee resource, you've got a couple of options. You could have resource pools and child resource pools as it goes, because we already have the workload resource pool, or you can have dedicated clusters, right? So yeah, it's kind of it's a driver by business requirements first, which is I guess boils down to money. But any other sort of cluster requirements or reasons for not going down the cluster separation route? Good. I'm taking silence. That means we've covered all potential outcomes and all options that can now or will forever be. Good. Okay, so I hope that kind of gives you a bit of an insight as to where you might need to separate, or reasons for separation, be it for the org, the SDDC, or the cluster. I guess the main negatives around having to separate workload types are always going to be cost and management overhead, which obviously translates into cost further down the line anyway. But yeah, cost primarily, and then just pure management. But I can't really think of any more off the top of my head of kind of negatives, although they are massive negatives, and for some might be might make a solution more cost prohibitive. But yeah, we see quite a lot of separation going on. I mean, you can see in our lab, we're deploying regionally, we're doing testing in different ones, but we often see departmental separation, and then workload type separation, or as Prasanna mentioned earlier, when you're breaching limits of a cluster. So you've deployed, you've got more than 20 odd hosts in a cluster, or you've got X number of clusters in an SDDC, so you need to provision more SDDCs. But yeah, anything else anybody can think of around reasoning why or why not to separate?
Yeah, just one more for the SDDC, where we cannot mix and match stretched and non-stretched.
Yeah, good point. And I
Maybe.
believe that there are plans in the works for that to come, right, Prasanna, where you can have stretched and non-stretched in the same SDDC, but I don't know when that's due for release.
Yeah, I think with M8 we announced support for mixing i3 and R5, but not
Yeah.
stretched.
Yeah, so that mixing workloads was asked for quite a lot. Hardware types, should I say, within the same SDDC. There's a bit of a limit before, but yeah, it's a good point. If you deploy, and this has got to be one of the first things that you think of. So as Zach also mentioned, and Prasanna mentioned, we would talk about high availability and DR and stuff like that. Disaster avoidance often comes into play before disaster recovery, hopefully. And when you're designing disaster avoidance you're thinking all the different layers where that either single point of failure is, and can we design it out, and what can we do to make the infrastructure or the platform more resilient and more tolerant of failure. And if you are stretching a cluster between AZs within a region, then you are inherently making the workloads that sit on top of it more resilient to loss, as long as you design your say your storage policies correctly. Theoretically, a region can go down, an AZ can go down, and you won't even notice. We had a customer recently that lost an AZ, and they had no awareness that it had gone down, apart from the alerting that we started pushing out. The workloads carried on working fine. So so that's one other side of it. Thank you for that. So yeah, I think I've done that to the death now. If there's nothing else to talk about from a separation perspective, we can move on. There was the other one I wanted to just bring up as well is another thing that actually came up earlier today that I was talking about with Ruth, and it was a really interesting use case for VMware Cloud on AWS. And I'll go back in time a little bit before I get to that. So that in the past, when people have done data center migrations, where they've closed out data centers, or they're moving from one data center to another, one of the approaches was kind of using what was known in the business as swing kit. So either renting storage and compute and migrating workloads onto that in the new data center before they could then pack up their existing kit, ship it over to the new data center, and then migrate back, or even a third site that you migrate to in order to then migrate back onto your original hardware in the new site, for example. That gives you the ability to have shorter downtime windows and make the DC migration or DC closure activity less painful to your customers and your end users. So the use case that we were talking about earlier was actually a customer had ordered hardware for a hardware refresh, and I can't remember, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, Ruth, but they'd ordered new hardware, but the hardware wasn't necessarily going to arrive in time for either the refresh cycle that was
Yeah, and they didn't have the resources internally to get it
absolutely,
done
yeah.
quick enough, basically.
So yeah, but I mean that's one that we see quite frequently with VMC, right? Is a lack of available resource internally, and that's, if you think about that, that's quite common because very few companies will keep staff on when they're not required. So you won't have staff sitting around doing nothing. Therefore, when a project comes up, they either have to work two jobs, or you have to bring in resource to do the project work or to backfill the internal staff that are then working on the project. So the advantage of something like VMware Cloud on AWS is the fact that you need very little resource in order to consume it, and migrate to it. And we can obviously provide you with things like professional services to backfill or to help you, in the same way that you could go out and source from the contract market. But the requirement of that resource is far less than if you were doing a self-planned data center to data center migration, because the platform is managed for you, if nothing else, deployed in about 3 to 4 hours, consumable straight away, and ready to migrate to. Now, the use case that we saw was that because their hardware refresh cycle was coming up and they didn't have the resource to do it, they'd ordered the hardware, but they still needed somewhere to put those workloads that were currently running, so that swing site or swing kit. So they purchased VMware Cloud on AWS for a year, knowing that it would be more than plenty time for them to migrate to, get the new hardware in place, rip and replace, get it all up to speed, and then migrate back to. And the nice thing about that is they had the platform for as long as they needed it. They migrated to and then migrated back. There was very little outage window for them, and it didn't really impact them. So it's something that I'd not really seen or thought of before as a use case, actually. A temporary, we all know about temporary usage of cloud for burst or whatever, but this is a full evacuation. Use it for while you need it, and then evacuate the cloud back onto on-prem. And the nice thing for us is that hopefully what that will do is it will show the customer the capabilities of the platform and how easy it is to set up, manage, and run with, so that in the future, if they need to do it again, they will, but hopefully they will start placing workloads on that platform, on the VMC platform, as an immediate alternative to thinking, right, let's buy some more hardware for our on-prem environment because that was so easy. I don't know if anyone else has seen that before as a use case. It was quite interesting to me. No, again, silence I'll take as that's the first time that's ever been explored in the entire world of IT. Brilliant. Just a reminder for those on chat, sorry, on Twitch or on Zoom, there is the chat panel and the Q&A panel. So if you are a bit shy about talking, knowing that we are listened to by literally 100 people, or potentially more, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. And again, if anybody has anything that they want to bring up, discuss, ask about, feel free, jump in, interrupt me. I don't take offense. If not, what we'll do is we'll do our usual sort of segue into a bit of a roundtable and just find out what people have been working on, anything new that's come up of late, because that might hopefully spark some other conversation. So I'll give you 20 seconds in case anybody has anything that they want to bring up.
I had a customer kind of in going to like just the migration piece. They had a data center outage. I think I mentioned this before, but there's a lot more different people on the
Yep.
call. But yeah, they had an outage, and I think like the fire suppression went off or something, and everything went down hard.
Yeah.
Well, it didn't damage the hardware per se, but taking down a huge storage array cold is very bad. So they were having some data loss issues and stuff. So they were able to in 1 week basically get 400 or 500 VMs up, and I helped them out with this, setting up HCX, and they had planned to go to VMC, but this incident, it kind of expedited their migration plan. So they had to come up with something fast, and VMC just really kind of filled that fit the bill for them, and they were able to start migrating right away quite easily.
That's great. I think that's one of those kind of great use case and stories that we hear fairly frequently. I've got another customer who something not similar in that they had a DC go down, but they'd had an internal project to consume cloud and migrate to cloud and refactor, and it had been running for a year or so, and they still hadn't actually done anything. And it was becoming cost prohibitive. So moving to the cloud was becoming too expensive before they'd even got anywhere near the cloud, just because it was taking them so long to analyze and discuss and work out what was going to go where and how they were going to refactor everything. And that's one of the key use cases of VMC, right? And something we see time and time again. And this customer actually ended up buying and consuming more and more of our infrastructure purely because of the ease of use. And I think there's one of the sort of system engineers who went in, did whiteboarding for 10 minutes, described it to them in its entirety, explained how easy it would be, did them a little demo, and they were sold, and then they were consuming within a matter of weeks after, a year and a half of failed planning and stuff already. So, and that's fairly typical, and we've probably all heard similar stories. But it's worth reiterating because it is so quick and so simple. But typically things that are that quick and simple are lacking in feature, or they're kind of a stopgap, whereas VMC is your full software-defined data center. It's just managed for you, right? So yeah, thanks, Zach. It's always good to hear sort of really positive stories like that. So anybody else? Otherwise, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna just pick on people alphabetically in my in my list of attendees, really. But I'm going to do it with the just the architects only for now, unless some of the customer success managers that are online also want to pitch in. Feel free, shout up. But otherwise, I'm going to jump straight to DeMarcus. Welcome to your first office hours call and the team. I'm not sure if you've actually spent much time out with customers yet, and if not, feel free to tell me and I'll move straight on. But otherwise, just anything interesting you've seen this week, anything you've been working on.
Hey, Will, thank you. So I haven't really had a bunch of time with customers, but I have had some shadow sessions with Ricky, dealing with getting HCX configured, getting the service profile, getting the compute profile, and service mesh, and then doing the layer 2 extension configuration, and actually seeing those migrations go from from on-prem to the SDDC and then back. So that's what I've seen, and so far
it's pretty cool, right? It's a bit like this decade's, or this this decade's new vMotion, isn't it? Really, it's that black magic that just kind of works. Interestingly, I did a cloud-to-cloud setup with stretching layer 2 last week. So the fun you had setting it up from on-prem to SDDC, we can use the same technology to migrate workloads from one SDDC to another, which kind of gets us over that security boundary, because there's obviously no physical sort of connectivity between SDDC 1 and SDDC 2. There's it's a separate set of hardware, and everything else is separated as well. So we can use HCX to migrate between the two. And you'll be really happy to know that the process for doing cloud to cloud, apart from the fact it's now GA and in the product, is about 1,000 times easier than setting HCX up from on-prem to the cloud, which in and of itself isn't that difficult. But because it's one cloud, that the cloud side is already pre-filled for you, as you'll have seen in the install, and you're doing two clouds, so everything is pre-filled. So all you have to do is say, yeah, I want to stretch this network, and you can either do that from vCenter, or you can do it from within HCX, and you just click, yeah, I want to stretch that, and it stretches it, and you're away. All the normal, caveats about not overlapping and having different networks in different SDDCs taken into account, the act of actually setting up takes about 10 minutes, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, that's impressive, and I think that HCX, it's a fantastic utility and endless opportunities and use cases.
Yeah, absolutely.
For that product.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've mentioned just now about customers struggling for a year and a half to work out which workloads to go to which clouds and how to get them there, and this, that, and the other. The fact that you can just live migrate, plonk them on VMC, and then deal with it later, or not, is another massive selling point. But the undiscussed selling point, I guess, about HCX is that when you're doing a data center evacuation, or you're doing application migration, you typically do lots of analysis first, and you put it all into these sort of categories or networks or subnets, or you base it based on an application and which application it touches. So you have to do all that sort of analysis, depending on your throughput and your location of your VMC relative to your on-prem stuff. You might not need to do most of that analysis, because if you're just stretching the layer 2 network and you don't have a huge amount of throughput, then you can treat it as an extension of the existing data center. So you can migrate those workloads without needing really to know where they talk to, because they will still be able to talk to the same places. So yeah, it's cool. Thanks for that, Demarcus. Fabio, hello.
Hi everyone. Well, my last week is quite easy, so all the customers are coming back from the holidays, so there are not lots of requests. Just checking if everything is working properly on several customers. So I got one customer that is using Horizon and Up Volume on VMC, so we got several issues on December. So we are checking that now everything is working properly. So when you start to mix different technologies, sometimes it's hard to find out if something is maybe not configured properly, or maybe it's not fully configured for the cloud. And so we found several bugs, but it's a lesson learned also this time. So now everything is working. So we can say that also all our Horizon technologies are working properly on VMC, and several other customers that are just looking to the best way to achieve the connection for several NFS external drive on VMC, and just looking on what's happened when we got an edge failover, just to avoid any kind of connectivity loss. So we are working on that side just to avoid that during the maintenance or whatever, they're losing sometimes the connectivity.
Sure.
And so we are working on that, and it's a little bit tricky because right now the edge is active passive, and so also several things of downtime. It's challenging for that kind of services. So we are trying to figure out how to grant to the customer the full accessibility to that shared storage.
Once you've worked that out, that'd be a really good one to sort of discuss on here, or go into in more detail, I think. On that point there where the customer has their NFS, is that hosted NFS, or is that NFS on-prem that they are wanting to still consume?
It's an hosted, is on cloud, so but everything is passing through the edge. That's the point right now, because it's just a single point of failure, let me say, because when we do any kind of maintenance.
Gotcha. So their decision to use hosted NFS instead of, say, a native AWS service, I guess, has been discussed, and they're already paying for it, or they decided to go down that route already, or.
Actually, I'm still trying to grab more detail about that because it's a customer that I've taken only a few weeks ago. So I'm still trying to discover everything. We are working with several partners, so it's hard. We are not working every time only with the customer. So there are different stakeholders. So I don't know why they are using that. So I started to work with the customer, but discovering that they are using that was deployed. That is the solution that the customer is using.
Okay.
We need to help
definitely.
them.
I'd definitely like to follow up on that one on here and offline, because I've certainly got another customer that's looking at options around, or what options exist around adding in kind of third-party storage natively. So not mapping it necessarily to the VMs, but making it available to VMC. But yeah, it'd be interesting to go into in more detail later on. Thanks for that.
Sure.
So Prasanna, again, I take into account that it's just been Christmas and this is the first call back. So I'm not surprised if most people are saying, yeah, I've not really done much so far. But if you've not seen anything, that's cool as well.
Yeah, I also don't have much to cover this week. Maybe I'll just touch upon this, whether we can transfer the subscription we took out for a region.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is not possible right now. We cannot transfer a subscription from one region to another.
So what you're saying there is when you first click that subscribe, when you've had funds allocated and you create a subscription from those funds and you deploy that in, say, Dublin in the EU, and then you decide to later on, actually I want to go and deploy in Stockholm now because it's available.
Yeah. So we can do that.
Yeah. So and that's, I mean, that is clearly documented in lots of places about once you click this button, you are subscribing, and it is for the entire term of the subscription. So be it 1 year or 3 years, and yeah, once you've done that, the money's locked in, the subscription is locked, the location, everything is fixed, right? So, but yeah, it's definitely worth. I know that's sort of come up today, hasn't it, mate? So yeah, definitely worth sort of reiterating. I think that's a good point. Who else we got? Ricky, you've been Demarcus's lead of late, but have you been playing around with anything other than HCX?
No, I've actually just been playing around a lot with HCX and having tons of conversations around should the customer leave up their L2 extension or should they bring it down, and pretty much going over the pros and cons of depending on which way they go, how we should architect it for them. I have a customer that really wants that hybrid cloud where he has the option to just move his VMs back and forth from on-prem to SDDC when he sees fit. So he's thinking about leaving the extension up, but obviously, you know, with that, there's some caveats that we have to kind of take into consideration.
Absolutely. I mean, there's one public use case, obviously, where one customer in the US they have left it up and they do bounce workloads around for locality reasons, I think, for performance. But yeah, I mean, it is a massive discussion, right? It's a big conversation piece about
Yes, it is.
you know, the resilience of that layer 2 stretch appliance, the whether to leave it up or just use it
Right.
and then shut it down again. So yeah, and so anybody that's watching the recording or sort of online now, I think that's more than a 1 hour conversation, but it's definitely an interesting one that we could go into in the future maybe and discuss the pros and cons in a bit more detail. So maybe if you're on YouTube now, then just add a comment whether you'd like to see that, or if you in the chat boxes just leave some feedback on that one. But yeah, it's definitely something we can go into in more detail, I think.
Yep.
Thanks for that. And then just Double Z left.
Yeah, I think I'm in the category of been pretty slow. Most of my customers are just now probably coming online this week, so I haven't had to jump into anything new so
Wow,
far.
your customers have long Christmas breaks, dude.
Apparently,
Nice.
I think people wait till after and then they take vacation the next
Yeah, it's
year.
a fair point. I mean, is Thanksgiving's bigger than Christmas in some parts of the US, though, right? Or just as big?
I usually get 2 days off standard for Thanksgiving.
Wow, you're all
So you get
spoilt by the, you know, your holiday allowances.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks, Zach. All right. Well, listen, if there are no further questions on chat or nobody else wants to dive in with a last minute question or comment, I will give you kind of just over 10 minutes of your day back. Thank you everybody for joining. It's really good, massive attendance today, which is really good for the first one of the year. Hopefully we can keep that running, and feel free to invite your customers or your colleagues to join the call in the future. Post comments on Twitch or YouTube about things you want us to discuss or cover, and any really sort of interesting corner cases maybe we can demo as well, build out in the lab and then demo for you. So yeah, please just drop us a line. Available directly on Twitter, either at Will Robbard or VMware Cloud AWS, and then you just search YouTube for the VMware YouTube channel. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll catch you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Will.